Don's book is called Poems from the Front and the Homefront. The format of the afternoon will be Don will read from the first part of his book, and then we will have an opportunity for contributions from the audience. I think we were somewhat warned that we would be hoping that other people may be able to contribute some memories of or about the Second World War. Don is a Carterton identity. He and Jan, among other things, have resuscitated the Carterton crier. The crier has always been a good friend of WWII, but prior to that, in other parts of the country, he had an extensive background in theatre and in trade union activities. As far as I know, this is his first book, but he can probably clarify that. He was to be our presenter in April, but the virus intervened because that was intended to fit in with Anzac Day. His book of poems are in reality excerpts from his father's letters home during World War II. I'm personally a little bit hazy about what constitutes a poem. Madeleine tells me there is a form called found poems, and that is what these are. They certainly seem beautiful and powerful to me. We're very glad we're able to finally present Don Farr.
Feels a bit like presenting a sermon. I don't take my father that seriously. These are poems from the front. War poems, assembled in this case particularly as part of the commemoration of the Peace Declaration of World War II. 75 years since the declaration of peace. As commented, they're taken from letters my father, Captain Ed Farr, chaplain to the forces, letters he'd written to a young associate back in New Zealand, for whom he had some responsibility to continue supporting his education and learning. So that was the main substance of the letters that we managed to finally received. The reporting from the war was a minor 3 or 4 lines along the bottom. Oh, while I'm at it, there's a war going on. He was senior chaplain in the whole Pacific area, then became moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, was ordered the OBE, and was widely known for his oratory and wit. The poems simply take some of the passages of his letters, which contain the perception, humour and compassion typical of him. I've given them this poetic form, which wasn't there, but I hope heightens the feeling and strength of the original texts. They might appear like a random set of reports from the front. That's because they are. They've been extracted from letters to home, where reporting was not their primary intention. So, New Caledonia. A pretty close shave the other night, hit by a tail end of a hurricane. A 10-foot length of 4x2 from a nearby hut landed on my tent. Missed me by a whisker. Tent flattened. Lost everything. Clothes, books, letters from home. Dawn. Made the rounds of the area dressed in blue pyjama pants and a cardigan. New Zealanders are funny blokes. They growl about the food, the officers and the dunnies. Blown out of their tents, searching for everything they owned, they think it's a great joke. Every time a tent came down, they cheered. Every time a tent went up, they cheered. I'd like to go into action with these chaps. Egypt. Finally docked after 3 scorching days on a boat. Now it's hotter. It stinks with heat. The sun is a white-hot ulcer in the sky. Italy, 1945. 6 to a tent, 5 dreaming of home. Taranaki farmer, Lofty, 6'4" in his gumboots, up and about 5:30 every morning. A piercing dog whistle. Damn that dog! Be down the back paddock worrying that dead sheep. Then he would make us all a cup of tea, and we sent our own dreams back to bed. Convalescence, Italy. All of us here are in for repair. The war just got too much for me. I miss my sappers, buried alive in a pile of bricks. Jerry blew a brick house down on us. Only 3 of us came out. The horror became a nightmare. (1945), near Florence. Near Florence, we found this young chap badly knocked around, dead, in an apple orchard, white with blossom. We rolled him up in an old grey army blanket and dug a grave amongst the trees. I laid a branch of apple bloom over him. He was so young. We buried him in blossom time. Florence. This is as a note, this was clearly after a session of touring around Italian sites as a tourist. In the heat of the day, in the narrow streets, a grandmother with a fair-haired child on her lap who wore only a shirt. Both asleep, his head resting on her breast, his cheek close to hers, her work-worn hand holding him. A long wisp of her hair falling over his face. With each of her shallow breaths, the wisp blew backwards and forwards. That was all. I knew I'd seen something very old, something by far older than the brick walls of Italy. Italy, 1945. A letter today from Helen, living alone in Devonport with 2 small boys, between the naval base and the army base, and under the North Head gun. More at risk now than I am in Italy. The war is over, you'll be home soon. I wish it was true. Solomon Islands, 1945. Gun emplacement on a lonely outpost, miles from the base overlooking the sea. a dozen chaps together, alone for weeks on end. Tell us, Padre, what's the news? We yarned for a couple of hours. That's all we did. That's all they wanted. Back on higher ground, drawn to their tent by a tapping sound, there was this chap, his tin plate on his knee, playing the drum with a knife and fork. Hello, Padre. So damn lonely and quiet, I just had to make a noise. He was just a boy looking after a gun. Solomon Islands. So hot, I must be right on the equator. So close that if I walked north, I could slip down the other side where it might be cooler. My heat rash is making me a bad-tempered padre. Like the whole camp, bandages over sores, plasters over boils, paint over rashes. Just part of occupying an island paradise. I met my first Japanese prisoner today. He was quite small. Too small to cause so much trouble. Not many taken as prisoners. And the homecoming. We're going home. Not to the homes we left, to the lives that they lived without us. And that's the end of that set of poems.
Yorkshire, 1943. Some rather large secondary school boys are heading to Tadcaster Grammar School in the Vale of York on the train, the steam train. And they were very exuberant that day. We were singing Bizet's Carmen, Toreador song, and we were Toreador, etc., etc. We looked out of the window and there was the remains of a crashed Halifax, which had returned to a base in Yorkshire and crashed into a forest. We shut up. We suddenly realised that war was not funny. Called David Kappa Tene.
Thank you.
I was born in September 1940. So my memories of the war are a battery radio that my parents listened to every single night that always ended with Big Ben, and the sound of it was, you know, it was like coming through water. You heard these male voices coming through water. And I don't remember hearing what they actually said, but I remember Big Ben at the end of it. And then the other thing I remember about the war, and this is my last thing, is swinging on the gate when I heard these bells ringing, and I ran down to the gate, and I was swinging on the gate, and I ran back and I said, what are the bells? And my mother said, the war's over. So, you know, it was nice.
Don, I was just going to ask, was your father attached to particular units as a padre, particularly in Italy?
No, he wasn't. He was attached to whatever forces were in the vicinity. Indeed, I don't know if I refer to it later or not, but I do know that when finally in No, when he was in Guadalcanal with a huge collection at that stage. The whole war seemed to have focused on Guadalcanal. There were apparently 6,000 American and New Zealand troops. And I remember, very much as a sideline, an address at his funeral where a military officer who had been there with him commented on the fact that he had addressed 3,500 troops in one hit, and it was all within a few days of leaving for New Zealand or for the States. And he threw away the book. To hell with the ritual. I'm going to tell you what it's going to be like when you get home, what you're going to have to face. One of these poems for the next section touches on that. But one of the reasons I mention it, because as a family we couldn't walk down the streets of any town without blokes coming up to him and stopping him. We'd go to a small South Island, just going on holiday, and oh God, we've been here an hour. That's it.
One of the things through doing genealogy, I remember years ago visiting a cousin, and he was giving us a breakdown on his family, and among the family he had 4 brothers who went to World War II, and of those 4, 2 returned and 2 lost their lives. And anyway, in the course of the exercise, it became evident that one of the brothers had sort of lost his life rather under unusual circumstances, to the extent that his parents, even at the end of the war, went to find out what their son had been up to. And anyway, as I was leaving my cousin, he gave me a photograph which showed his brother's grave in Greece. And he said, I'd love to know what happened to my brother Jack. And I said, well, surely he died, in the war. And he said, yeah, but he was executed by firing squad, which of course aroused immediate curiosity. And anyway, I said to him, look, leave it with me for about 6 months. I'll sort this one out for you. Well, 6 months morphed into 18 years. 18 years. This man's death has been concealed from the public by the Official Secrets Act, all sorts of things there. They wanted to do a cover-up. And unfortunately, men like him have been denied their share of glory. In a nutshell, Jack, his name is Jack Stewart, came from Pahawatanui. Fought on the island of Crete, as many New Zealanders did, was taken as a wounded prisoner of war and flown over to Athens at the hospital. He convalesced, and as like so many Allied servicemen in that hospital, to show their appreciation, they escaped and joined, in the case of Jack and a couple of others, they joined the Greek resistance. And there became what we call MI9 agents. MI9 being the escape and evasion people. They weren't trained in this, but there were lots of Allied servicemen on the run in mainland Greece and on the island of Crete, either had escaped as POWs or had evaded capture. And these guys would be rounded up and they'd send them back to Alexandria by either kaiki, that's the Greek fishing boats, or by submarine. And then from there, in the case of Jack and his group, they were caught by the Italians, who took a dim view of what they were doing. There had been a shootout in downtown Athens, and they had made their getaway for a while until they got caught. And sadly, that group were caught and brought before an Italian tribunal, and they were condemned to death through firing squad. And so until now, Jack's story and those who were with him has been sort of lost in the annals of history and concealed. When in fact the work that they were doing, you know,
It was heroic.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So anyway, Don, thank you for the opportunity for that. A little bit of
for your contribution.
The Italians probably, if they were left to themselves, would have let him off. But the Germans were breathing down their necks. And the Italians didn't really have much choice than to do that, I think. Would that be true, you think?
I hear what you're saying, and you're probably quite correct in what you've said, but my research over the last 30 years now would suggest that the actual, in this case, the president of the Italian tribunal who sentenced them to death, who was a General Magaldi. Magaldi had one leg. I'm not sure how he lost his leg, but he had a wooden leg, and he had 3 sons who were in the Italian Air Force that were shot down by British pilots. So he was slightly biased towards the anti-British feeling, having lost 3 sons, and understandably so. But unfortunately, he would condemn to death. There was something like some 10,000 people that he had condemned to death over the period of time that they ran these tribunals. And at towards the end of the war, he did actually get caught and was taken into custody by the British, and then his trail dries up. It just disappears. We don't know exactly what happened to him. He became a wanted man. We have a feeling that he's probably the Yugoslavs would have got him, Tito's crowd. They were very much after him as well. They would have probably given him 5 minutes and then probably shot him. But so he has disappeared, although today he would be dead. I mean, he was a very old man then. So, yeah, that's how that came about.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Time to hit part 2, which is poems from the home front. These poems occasionally relate to the circumstances under which my mother lived during World War II, but they're not about her, and they're not exact. Poems don't do exact. They're about fears, threats, horrors, and loneliness that those at home went through, and some of the consequences. Much of what I've got here is based on family yarns covering the war and family history. Partir. If you don't know Partir, it's a very small was a freezing works town until they closed the freezing works in Taranaki. Partir, 1942. Freezing works wharf at the Partir river mouth. Breakers rolling up the riverbed, no harbour in a westerly swell, no shipping movements, no ships, no crossing the bar tonight. Town shuttered and closed, braced for the storm, braced for the invasion. They'll come by sea, the Japanese warriors. Bella and Bunty sealed a pact. If they invade, said Bella to Bunty, we will hold hands and walk together into the sea. We will, said Bunty to Bella. We'll just keep walking.
Sounds like Reggie Perry.
Telegram. 1942, still Partir based. The phone call came at midnight. It's your Auntie Lina. It's about Len. The voice drawn, tight. I'll just read you the telegram. Deeply regret to inform you that your son, Pilot Officer Leonard Farr, has been reported killed in action. The Prime Minister desires me to convey to you on behalf of the government deepest sympathy in your loss. Singapore, 1942. Singapore airfield, scramble sirens. 100 invading aircraft, their drone coming louder and louder and closer. Throbbing power. Len Farr running to his plane, chocks away, open throttle. A hail of bombs blasting him off the runway, pierced in the back by shrapnel shreds. Buried with his crew in an unmarked common grave. Only their names remain on a marble wall in Singapore. That's it. I've been there, got the photo. Still 1942 Paotearoa. The signs were clear. Paotearoa did not need a padre. The troops did. The call, not to arms, but to the armed. Devonport, 1943. Father at the front, an undisclosed location. For us, a house on the Devonport harbour front. Mother and 2 children landed on our feet. Prime location between the army barracks and the naval base. Safe harbour. Then the war took a turn. Submarine attacks, Singapore, Darwin, Sydney Harbour, then us. The notice was official, reliable, chilling, like a telegram in the night. The most likely attack will be bombardment from the sea. Prime target, the army barracks and the naval base. Devonport went black. Blackout blinds and blankets, no street lights, no safety at night, no safety during the day, no safe harbour. Devonport, 1944. Family working party. Grandpa is the foreman. The man with the plan, hat and tie, and control of the shovel. A dugout trench in the back lawn, 4 feet deep. When the siren blows, run for the trench, pull the iron sheet over your heads, hunker down. Green slime on the trench now brimmed with water. In our backyard, no safe harbour. Survival. Everyone said it'd be over by Christmas, but it wasn't. It was a dream. A hope lost. But none gave up hopes. Just one day at a time. In the middle of the night, crying into their pillows so the children couldn't hear. Those telegrams. Through spy holes in the blackout curtains, we all watched. The postmaster cycling up the street. Not the telegraph boy, the postmaster, the bearer of grim news. The street holds its breath. Together, but each alone. The messenger passes on. Around the corner, a family is broken. We watchers are together again. Together, we fear the next telegram and the next. Nothing safe. A batch of scones. Well, you've got to do something. The arrival, 1945. A long train whistle blows. I'm squashed between my mother and an iron railing. Soldiers stream from the train. There's Dad! A man with a sack on his shoulder. I don't know him. He smiles at me. Hello, Uncle Dad. Reunions. Down our street, they all say, when their man came home, they didn't have much to say. They both ran out of things to say. Just stories that are worlds apart and deaths that cannot be spoken of. Both of them said, you just had to have been there. Marriages torn apart, some by living alone, some by living never alone. For some, divorce was the only solution. There was an option available. Separation for more than 3 years. Never their hope. In a war that was never their choice. Both alone yet again. Collateral damage in the home front. That's it. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other response, though, to the second section?
Are we allowed two?
Yes, as long as they're not both the same.
Thank you.
Don, on page 14, the Partia 1942. Just last week we were on our way home from New Plymouth and we stopped. We actually drove down exactly to that place at the bar at the river mouth of Partia.
Yeah.
And it was a wild day. What a wild and inhospitable place. And I have an uncle who was drowned on the bar at Wanganui. And just as you read that, I just thought, wow, walking into that sea would have taken a huge amount of courage for those two women.
Yes,
and
yes.
Yet, just listening to you reading, that's what they would have done.
Yeah. The consequences, though, you've described the Partia Sea. Yes, yes, indeed. I know it well. I can show you the shingle damage. Okay.
Just wondering what's between the two fronts, the battle front and the home front. Is it you? If it is, what's your space in between those fronts?
Not sure what you mean. And in what I tried to do, the second part is much more personal, and so I've started with the technical's the wrong word, but with what is really quite refined reporting from the front, and then wanting to slide that as best as I can into but the other story is what's going on at home, and the turmoil that wasn't just in the Pacific Islands, the turmoil and domestic damage and ruin the marriages shattered. Just very little written about it, very little. But that's it.
Helen Dew. I was born in 37, and I do remember the bells and the riotous celebration in the streets. The streets were awash with booze and vomit and singing like you never heard. And my brother, a couple of years younger than me, didn't know his father, and his father didn't know him. They never bonded. It was a most difficult relationship right through that part of time, collateral damage.
You said, especially on the home front, that the poems are sort of have come together from memories of conversations and exchanges and what have you after the war. And I think I heard you welcome your dad as Uncle Dad. So I'm wondering, while he was away, if you have any memories, because you would have been sort of up to the age of 5 or 6, I imagine, any memories for yourself of that experience of him being away and his communications with your mother?
Not really, no, he was, by the time I was old enough to have more than just sort of baby memories, he was gone.
No, I mean, while he was gone, your experience of his absence.
Oh, right. No, I don't think I can answer that because I don't think I have experience of his absence. He was an unknown. It was us kids and Mum. That was it. Yeah. Oh, and the woman who lived down the road. That was our bubble.
So now we'll talk about it.
No.
I was just going to say that the bit you heard about your father convalescing after all those sappers dying did remind me of my father talking about my grandfather, who was an airman, and I'll probably get some figures wrong, but basically he ended up having an aptitude for training as well. So he was training a lot of the other airmen, and he was due though to ship out on a mission, and I think it was 24 other, he was going to be the 25th. And at the last minute they made the decision that he was too valuable as a trainer and they couldn't send him. And none of those 24 guys survived. And my father talked about the impact that had on him to be a survivor. And so when you're talking about your father in recovery and surviving and that sort of thing. But I guess the one, maybe to end on a slightly happier note, was that my final visual memory of him was he has survived. I certainly, as a grandfather, didn't see that reflected, what he'd gone through in how he was with us. And the last visual memory I have is that we took our son as a little baby to see him, and we turned around at one point and he had this little baby on his knee and he bit him on the nose. And Sam wasn't shocked or anything, it was just this absolute pure, I could eat this baby, it's so nice. and it just came out as a physical thing, and that ended up being, my grandfather who survived all that and raised a family that, had his great grandchild, and that was the very last memory I had with him. Right. Yeah.
I just wanted to share, my father fought first in Egypt and then Monte Cassino, and just how those reverberations carry on through the generations, because I don't know whether it was a desire for life in the midst of death, but he first had an illegitimate child, my oldest sibling, when he was working, when he was at one of the training camps. And my grandmother adopted her. Then he, in Rome, married a woman who was a member of the Italian resistance. But that marriage didn't survive, returned to cold London. And then he had a relationship in Austria when he was sent to be part of the Allies' reconstruction of Austria. He's an electrical engineer. And we never knew about Gitta until I was in my 50s and she was in her 60s, and she contacted me. So there are 4 children from my father, and certainly the 3 older ones were all connected directly with the war, and I was connected with the war because my mother was a physio, and she treated his hip wound from the war, and she saw him walk in and said, "I'll put him on my list." 50 years of happy marriage ensued to give a happy note to the end of that family story.
Thank you.
I just have a small memory. My mother was born in 1937 in Stuttgart, and she lived, believe it or not, on a street called Paradiesstrasse, Paradise Street. And she had to go to a small town for her safety and her sister's safety. And the kind of living memory that we see as the kids, we were all born in, most of my siblings were born in the States, and we didn't learn a word of German in the house because it wasn't the right time to be learning German in America after World War II. But for my mother, that I see often is every time she hears a crow, she just cringes. And her love of birds is minimal. It's just one of those things that would happen when there was a bomb going off in the country, that the birds would know it first and flutter off. And that's
a warning.
Yeah. And I just thought it was so sad that she really can't enjoy birds. Imagine living in New Zealand.
I actually had something as well. I feel like, oh, I'm not really a microphone, but since Madeleine went, then I'm going to go as well. I have a great uncle who walked home from the Eastern Front, and he's Hungarian, so he's on the wrong side of the war, and he had been conscripted by the Germans and was fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front. And in 1944, he thought, who are these people and why am I fighting for them or against them? And decided to walk home, which was hundreds and hundreds of miles. And I just wish I knew more about the story, because that's pretty much all I know about it.
It's hard to believe, except that I was there. 1942, we had a house on a hillside in a small village in Yorkshire, and I heard an aeroplane. So I went to the window, my bedroom window. I was 12, and there was a propeller, a Spitfire propeller, advancing on the window. It was coming towards me, right towards me. That's why I can't really believe this. And obviously there was a plane behind it with its Merlin engine, etc. And I could see the pilot. And the plane, I thought it was going to come straight to the house, but it went straight over the house. And of course I can actually see the propeller as I talk to you. Called David Capitene Uncle.
I had a neighbour, a Czechoslovakian man, and he had very, very broken English. Most people weren't bothered to try and understand his speech. He lived in Carterton here, but worked in Wellington, and he was accounting work. Took the train every day. He put his bike to the train, and so I developed a little bit of a friendship with him. He was a loner. He had really no friends. Lived in a very big house, which was absolutely chock full of all kinds of goods, beautiful suits, linen, silver, art, all kinds of things that he was saving up for his nephew, who was still in Czechoslovakia. And his dream was to get him out of Czechoslovakia. And he couldn't go back there because he had run away. And God knows what experiences he would have had and finding his way to New Zealand. So damaged. And yet he lived with that hope all his life. When he died, I was executor of his will. He died having had a fall off his bike. He was quite old, and he was in a nursing home. And I arranged for a Czechoslovakian speaker to go and visit him, which he greatly appreciated. And I used to visit him. He eventually died. And we had a little funeral for him. And there were a couple of nurses from the nursing home present at the funeral. The reading that was chosen was about God even knows the sparrow has fallen. And the nurses said to me afterwards, how did you know about the sparrow? And I said, I'm sorry, I'm lost. They said, a couple of days before Walter died, a sparrow entered the lounge of the nursing home. He had a great love of animals. He managed to take hold of that little sparrow. He caressed it, took it to a window, and released it. It's a beautiful story.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. It's now 4 o'clock. So that probably brings us to a wind up. Back over to Steve.
I don't have any war stories. My father was in the Territorial Army before the war and almost certainly would have served overseas, except he had the great good sense to lose the sight of an eye working in a quarry during the Depression, and spent his war at Fort Dorset, so no tragedies in our family, but plenty afflicted a whole generation of New Zealand men and women after the Second World War. And considering that that was a generation that ran this country for a long time, I sort of wonder sometimes, how we got to where we are. Don, you've managed to bring a lot of things home to a lot of people, and I think the afternoon has gone extremely well. WWII receives some funding from the Carterton Creative Communities Scheme, so we are able to thank our guest writers with a small contribution. Thank you very much.